Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first event in our Sussex School for Progressive Futures launch series. For those of you who don't know, my name is Buzz Harrison, and I'm Dean of the Sussex School for Progressive Futures. The school is the university's new flagship hub for interdisciplinary education, research, and global engagement in our three transformational themes that are underlying the Sussex 2035 strategy. These are digital and data futures, environmental sustainability, and human flourishing. Over the last few months, we've been busy setting up the school. This has included moving into our wonderful new space in the library, which we can be using for meetings and for public events. Also curating an interdisciplinary teaching offer, including new flagship first-year electives in each of our three themes. We've been supporting and amplifying our research and innovation across the four faculties, and helping to ensure that our students are equipped for global citizenship and for life and work in a changing world. As I said, we're developing a programme of launch events in each of our three themes. Our next event, after this one, is entitled From Despair to Action, Building Progressive Futures. And it will involve our Professor of Practice in Environmental Sustainability, Caroline Lucas, alongside a range of other speakers. So put it in your diary. It will be here in the ACCA on February the 18th at 5:30 p.m. And there's information on the ACCA website about that. So for our first event today, we're delighted to welcome Lord Peter Hain, Sussex alumnus, anti-apartheid activist, and former government cabinet member, in conversation with our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sasha Roseneil. They'll be discussing ideas from Peter's new book, Liberation and Corruption, Why Freedom Movements Fail. And you can buy a signed copy of the book in the foyer at the end of this session. From my perspective, the book raises really important questions that are at the heart of the challenges of achieving human flourishing. These include not only the significance of historical legacies, but also the ways in which struggles for power can undermine well-intentioned ideals of human rights and of social justice. However, I am sure that these are themes which Sasha and Peter are going to be picking up on, and so I now hand the floor to you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Buzz. This is actually a very special moment, I think, in the life of the university, not just because we've got one of our most distinguished alumni back here to talk to us, but because this is the first real kind of public event of the Sussex School for Progressive Futures. So thank you all for coming along. And especially, Peter, thank you for coming. It's wonderful to welcome you back to Sussex. For those of you that don't know, and I think there's probably a mixture in the audience of people who know quite a lot about Peter Hain and others who don't, because I can see quite an intergenerational mix. The Right Honourable Lord Peter Hain was born in Kenya to South African parents who were anti-apartheid activists. And you came together to the UK from South Africa. You were a teenager at the time. You'd actually grown up before that in Pretoria, and in fact you've written a book called A Pretoria Boy about that. Peter became very rapidly a very well-known anti-fascist and anti-apartheid campaigner in the 1970s and onward from there. And you were a student at Sussex. We'll talk a little bit about that. And there's quite an interesting, maybe quite difficult story about that, so we'll ask you about that in a minute. But you've also had really quite an incredible political career in the last 30 years, more than 30 years. You were elected to Parliament as Labour member for Neath in 1991 and held shadow ministerial roles, initially serving in Tony Blair's government as a junior minister in the Wales office, In 2001, you moved briefly to the Department of Trade and Industry before returning to the Foreign Office as Minister for Europe and becoming a member of the Privy Council. You later became, in 2002, Secretary of State for Wales as a member of the Cabinet, but also continued to represent the UK at the Convention on the Future of Europe. And in 2003, you became Leader of the House of Commons and Lord Privy Seal, which is an obscure concept, I think, to many non-Brits.
Very obscure.
In a cabinet reshuffle, but retaining the Wales portfolio. After the 2005 general election, you were appointed as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland by Tony Blair, whilst also retaining Wales. And you played a big role in negotiating settlement in relation to Northern Ireland, particularly from 2007. You've also served as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, also continuing to contain responsibility for Wales. And at the Department of DWP, you were particularly involved in setting compensation for the taxpayer-funded financial assistance scheme, similar to that of the industry-funded pension protection fund for those whose schemes had collapsed before that. And this was hugely important to people who had lost pensions, either because their employers became insolvent or that employers that couldn't pay their debts to their pension schemes. So really important reform there. You'd served before 2015 then as an MP for almost 25 years in a number of different cabinet roles. But you're now in the House of Lords. You are a Lord and currently a backbench peer, serving also on the Northern Ireland Scrutiny Committee still, and continuing to be very active in scrutinising legislation and contributing regularly to debates. We gave you an honorary degree from Sussex a few years ago, 2023, which was, I think, a great honour for us to recognise your career as a very distinguished alumnus who really had spent quite a bit of time at Sussex. And you continue to be part of our Sussex community. Just very recently, you very kindly hosted the launch of Research Plus in the House of Lords, which is our new group of research-focused universities, and it was great to have your support there and have you speaking with us. But along with all this, I mean, this is what is most phenomenal. Peter has written 29 books. I mean, it just blows my mind. You know, our most prolific academics rarely ever get anywhere near that. You're doing this alongside holding really major political roles that involve a lot of travel. And we are here to talk particularly about this book, Liberation and Corruption, Why Freedom Movements Fail, which has recently been published. But I mean, there is so much more to you. You've also written a number of thrillers. You've written autobiography, A Pretoria Boy. You wrote a book called A Putney Plot, which I'll come on to in a moment. Books about sport, racism and resistance, again, related to things you've been involved in. You've ranged, you know, across sort of politics, biography, history, and, you know, really sharp political analysis, as well as, you know, writing a very substantial number of fiction books. It's really quite phenomenal. I don't know how you get the time. All in all, it's an enormous contribution. It's absolutely phenomenal. Now, I'm not going to say it all started at Sussex. It didn't, clearly. It started, you know, you were born in Kenya. You had your early childhood in South Africa. You clearly had really interesting parents. But you had quite an interesting time when you were at Sussex. Could we start off by you just telling us a bit about how you came to be at Sussex, what you were doing, and what happened during the time you were here?
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting me, and thank you for all coming. My mother-in-law had a very dim view of the title of Lord. She was devout Catholic, and I said to her, "You're going to have to call me the good Lord." And she said to me, I can't think of anybody less like a good Lord than you. Anyway, I loved my time at Sussex, save for one particular dramatic incident when I was charged. I just started typing up, because in those days you had typewriters in October 1975, the first chapter of my PhD, and there was a knock on the door and I was arrested for a bank theft that I knew nothing about. And this rather completely wrecked the rest of the year. It was in my third year. And so I had to abandon the PhD, and it was later converted into an MPhil. So I did graduate from this university, but I love my time here. But that was the incident that completely changed everything. I should just say, I knew nothing about this bank theft. It was, I'm not just saying that to you, it's genuine. But it was committed, it was shown later by a South African agent of apartheid who looked rather like me, and they were trying to fit me up, which they managed to do, because I landed up in the Old Bailey for 2 weeks. But that rather, I mean, it just took over my life, and it meant that I couldn't finish my PhD.
And can I ask about your anti-apartheid activism? What were you doing? So some of us actually remember, but there are younger members of the audience and perhaps people who weren't attuned to what was going on. Can you tell us a bit about your involvement in the anti-apartheid?
Well, I was always sports fanatic and brought up in South Africa. I mean, the Kenya thing, I just was a tiny baby, really. My parents are both South African born, and they came back to South Africa with me when I was still a baby. And they got more and more involved in anti-apartheid activism, but to the point where my mother was banned, issued with a banning order. They were both jailed in 1961 when I was 11 years old and woken in the early hours to explain that that had happened, which is pretty scary. Then my mother was banned, then my father was banned, and then they stopped him working as an architect, and we had to come into exile. But I was always keen on sport. And when I got here, increasingly, as I got a bit older, I became focused on the idea of stopping racist sport, because in those days, South African teams were all white. You couldn't represent your country if you weren't white. And I remember the head of South African rugby saying in 1969, "Over my dead body, will there ever be a black Springbok?" Well, of course, a black Springbok captain lifted the World Cup trophy in 2019 and 2024, which, you know, was in a sense what we were aiming for. But I focused on sport, and I thought, let's use the non-violent direct action of the late 60s. There were the student occupations, there was in the US, a bit difficult to imagine what would happen if there was a student occupation in the US now. I think Trump would send, you know, aircraft carriers onto campuses, I should think. But so there was the idea of applying non-violent direct action, as the Paris student revolt as well, to sport, running on the pitch and being lifted off and doing all sorts of other things. Well, we booked a young woman into the Springbok Hotel in central London in the middle of the tour, and she discovered wasn't terribly difficult because they all were very friendly with her. She was extremely attractive. I don't mean that in any kind of sort of objectifying way. She just was. And so all the Springboks were all over her. And she found out where they were staying and injected solidifying agent to their door locks in the early hours of the morning. So they couldn't get out of there without breaking the doors down. This is on the morning of International. Then we got a guy who was dressed in a suit, which none of us were at the time, and I certainly wasn't when I was a student on this campus in the early 70s, who was wearing a suit, who climbed onto the Springbok coach, which engine idling, asked the driver to come in and talk to the management, took over the coach, chained himself to the steering wheel, drove it off and crashed. Not surprisingly, the Springboks lost to England. Which doesn't happen very much these days. But so it was that kind of thing that we were doing. It wasn't violent, but it was militant. And it stopped the cricket tour, which was the objective, and it more or less wrecked the rugby tour to the point where there never was a cricket tour or rugby tour again until Nelson Mandela came out of prison and the transformation began.
So you came to... you came to Sussex to do a PhD. What was your PhD about?
It was in the Institute for Social Sciences, or whatever it's called, and it was about neighbourhood participation. So it was about local direct democracy. and that involved studying and doing my empirical research in London, but on the back of very good teaching at the university and supervision and so on.
And I mean, Sussex at that point had a number of South African students in exile. Were you aware of that? Was that part of why you chose to come to Sussex?
It wasn't really. There were other reasons, but you had the former president who succeeded Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, Aziz Pahad, who became a foreign minister, his brother Ehud Pahad, Esop Pahad, who was a senior minister in the presidency under Mbeki, and like his sort of senior ministry in every respect. So there were a number of anti-apartheid activists who came here before me, actually, in the 60s,
But that wasn't what drew you to Sussex particularly?
Not especially. I was aware of that, but there are other reasons why I ended up here.
Okay. I mean, there is this remarkable fact that half of Nelson Mandela's first cabinet had studied at Sussex, which is really quite phenomenal.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting that that wasn't why you came here. So, you are, of course, now part of that sort of South African Sussex link. Let's get on to your book, your most recent book, Liberation and Corruption, for sale outside at reduced price, and you get it signed. It's a really good read, but it's also a kind of significant analysis of the significant problem of the kind of disappointment of hope for political, social, economic change that has come about in many countries when movements of resistance, liberation movements, post-colonial movements come to power, displace the previous authoritarian or colonial regime, and either quite quickly or either don't manage to achieve change or achieve some change and then sort of slip back. So, I mean, I found it a really powerful analysis and actually full of things that I didn't know about. I felt rather ashamed that I didn't know quite how bad the problem of corruption is globally. But could you say something to start off with about why you wrote this book? Why do you care so much? Why does it matter so much that amongst all the other things you could be writing about, you wrote a whole book on this?
Well, I became haunted by the fact that, the anti-apartheid movement, including on this campus, had been massively supported across the world. I say massively. It was always a minority movement, like all radical change movements are. The suffragettes are praised now, but they were in a minority, vilified at the time. And so we had a lot of people who were rallying to the cause, and I was one of them. And I'd then, post-Mandela, and especially under former President Zuma, the corruption became absolutely all-embracing. And they say a fish rots from the head. And of course, the president was corrupt, and he had his business cronies. And then I looked at Nicaragua and I remember posters of the Sandinista, the liberation movement, Daniel Ortega, you nodding, so maybe you remember them at your university. I remember them here, the Students' Union, along with Mandela. He was a pin-up of radical opinion. And when he's now a corrupt, misogynistic, nepotistic dictator. So I thought, well, hang on, we marched, we struggled, in my case, and others, we risked quite a lot. And why had this happened? And the easy answer would be, oh, well, left-wing liberation movements become corrupt in power, like happened in Eastern and Central Europe in the former Soviet satellites, which I touch upon. But it's much more complex. And so as I searched for the answer, and I didn't really know fully the answer that you've been kind enough to sort of praise, I realized that actually the corruption that is almost ubiquitous in these countries, whether they've had actual liberation movements like South Africa and the ANC, or Nicaragua and the Sandinistas and many others, or independence movements like Gandhi's movement in India, which I look at, when they get into office, they become corrupt. And what I realized, and I think this is explained, I hope so, it's explained that colonialism was deeply corrupt, and I explained that. Apartheid was deeply corrupt. Some white opinion says, Well, apartheid may have been brutal. I've seen this, written, but at least it wasn't corrupt. No, it was deeply corrupt. Deeply, deeply corrupt. So what you find is these well-intentioned liberation movements, as you indicated, or as I think Buzz indicated, fighting for social justice and human rights and so on, then inherit a corrupt system which seems to suck them in. And the same with, India, the Congress Party, which had been so heroic under Gandhi, became corrupt in power and eventually lost office for that reason. And the ANC's support has crumbled, and so for the first time in 2024, they lost power. Now, the great thing, to its great credit, South Africa and the ANC, is when they lost power, they accepted that. And too many places, you lose power, you don't accept it, and you retrospectively rig the election, like, has happened in Zimbabwe consistently. So that was, I suppose, a search for an answer and discovering that actually colonialism was corrupt, explaining that. The systems that, for example, the Sandinistas, when they took power in a corrupt system. And now today, and this is part of the picture too, we in this country, and China and the UAE and a lot of other countries actually facilitate this corruption. Because just to give you one sort of fact, the statistics are explained in the book, Africa is supposedly a recipient of fantastic global North largesse in overseas aid and development funding. And that's true. But more money is robbed from Africans, is looted from Africans, and finds its way into London and Dubai and Hong Kong and other places by the global North countries, because the looters don't want to keep it in their own country. They want to invest it in the London property market or wherever it might be, where they think it's safer and gives them a better return. So this is a story which starts off in the way that I describe. It ends up saying, actually, we're all complicit. And if we don't do something about it, there's no good complaining about corruption 5,000 to 6,000 miles away in South Africa's case, or Nicaragua's case, a shorter distance away. You've got to actually realize your own complicity.
I mean, your point about how corruption is undermining, attempts at aid intervention was a very powerful one. But I mean, I think your attempt to sort of show the networks of corruption across the world too is so important. Any sort of sense of sort of global North superiority about corruption in the global South, you really do not let that stand in this book. Because that's very easy, isn't it?
It is.
It's a very easy kind of, well, those countries are all very corrupt.
Yeah, black Africans are innately
not
corrupt.
Doing that at all.
It's not. They're no more innately corrupt than white British.
Yeah.
And we saw what happened under COVID, which I have a whole section.
Well, you do. I wanted to come to that because I think actually, it's not just that you're looking at the kind of global flows of corruption, which I think is hugely important, and the ways in which so many kind of global, multinational companies, household names, including audit companies and global consultancy firms, and a whole range of those kind of organisations are sort of deeply complicit, and the banks, the kind of global banks, are involved in that sort of network of corruption. But you do not let Britain off at all, or France, or Spain.
Or Spain, no.
They get a lot of attention, and I suppose I remember COVID is a bit of a blur, isn't it, for everyone? It's like what went on during those sort of 2 years. But the COVID PPE scandal, the kind of corruption at the heart of government during COVID, you talk about that a fair bit. I mean, is that something that you got very interested in at the time, or is it?
Well, I thought it was important. I sort of was aware of it at the time, but I think it was important to point out that this is not a problem just for faraway countries or former colonies of European powers. It's actually something that every country, every society can be prone to or tempted by corruption. And it happens, you know, and I mean, we have the famous case of a member of the House of Lords who was involved in all sorts of shenanigans and denied it and then had to admit it, and has now been sort of, doesn't ever appear. But then lots of lords don't appear. Perhaps the most famous one is Ian Botham, who I think was ennobled by Boris Johnson. I just mentioned that in passing, by the way. It's not. But the people who, so there are over 800 peers, over 800. And we're the second largest legislature in the world after the People's Congress of the Republic of China. It's completely indefensible. And now there's, you know, having abolished the, sorry, I'm getting on to a rant about the House of Lords, but having abolished the last 92 hereditary peers, who all, and the Conservative Party was just kicking and screaming about this and being really difficult. So they were all saying, we've got to reform the whole place, and you're only doing this one thing. So we're now saying, fine, well, let's look at participation and age. You know, you've got some pretty ancient people there, even older than me, and I'm 76, coming on 76 now. But there's some people who, to be blunt, are a bit gaga. And they shouldn't be there. And others who just don't, there are others who work very hard, who speak a lot, whatever their age, some of them in the late 80s or early 90s, so I'm not making an ageist point.
And some of them are Sussex alum
some
as well.
Some of them are Sussex alumni, yeah. And of course they work very hard, the Sussex alumni. But, so I think it desperately needs reform. But the point I'm making is that wherever you look in every part of the world, corruption occurs. But I think this particular phenomenon that I'm focusing on here of liberation and independence movements is a post-colonial product, phenomenon.
I mean, there's something, I suppose, about the dashed hopes, the disappointment, the lives lost, the lives dedicated to struggle, you know, that accumulates through kind of activism, and the hope that's invested in the future, and then the disappointment, the despair when that is not, you know, when it's undone or it's not fully realised. I mean, is that part of what motivated this for you? Is there a kind of
yes, it was a feeling that, you know, we didn't fight, didn't struggle in the anti-apartheid struggle, or those who were active in the Nicaraguan struggle supporting the Sandinistas. We didn't do it to end up with this stuff. And so there was that motivation, but it was also really realizing, and particularly in the case of South Africa's story, you know, I remember going as a parliamentary observer in 1994, a British parliamentary observer, to observe the South African elections, the first democratic one ever, and being, you know, moved almost to tears by what I was witnessing. People sort of steaming out of the early morning mist in Soweto and so on, in their tens of thousands to vote for the first time in their lives. And thinking, job done. Actually, I end up the book saying, the struggle is never over.
A luta continua.
Yeah, a luta continua is the last chapter, is the Portuguese sort of slogan used by some in the liberation struggle, that the struggle continues. And it's actually it's a new phase that you think you've achieved a great deal. And, you know, if I go back to the Labour government that I was fortunate enough to serve in for 12 years, and we achieved a lot, if you take Iraq out of it, if you can, that notwithstanding, achieved a lot. But most of it was reversed by what followed, particularly 14 years of austerity. And in South Africa's case, those values, which were very noble and I think motivating for a lot of people, then got completely betrayed in office by too many people. And so I realized that actually the struggle is never over. There are always fresh battles to fight, and continually to think, well, if you just take broad principles like liberty and human rights and social justice and equal opportunities, those constantly have to be strived for, because there's always forces wanting to roll them back or stop them at any point in time.
I mean, what are those forces? I mean, are they forces of human nature? Are they, you know, is there something ultimately corruptible in everyone? Is it something in the kind of, I don't know, you might call the social unconscious that dates back to, you don't use that concept, that's a concept I might have used, but or something
Sounds
that you
very
might
complicated to me.
Well, I suppose it's about what sits there underneath that isn't explicit. You know, that people are not speaking about explicitly, but what continues to exist in society, but doesn't get named publicly, but actually has a powerful impact. I mean, political scientists might talk about path dependency, you know, but actually there are things that are laid down in history, and actually it's very hard to change course when there are kind of, you know. So I suppose it's really interesting to try to understand, why do hopes get dashed? Why is this powerful kind of movement of social transformation derailed? Is it a few bad actors? Well, it's not just a few bad actors. It's lots of bad actors.
Yeah.
Why? You know, is there something in human nature that is kind of, you know, inevitably greedy, selfish, you know, out for themselves? I don't believe that, but you know, that would be one sort of way of answering this question of why does it happen. Another is the more historical kind of argument that there are just incredibly powerful historical forces, whether they're the social unconscious or path dependency of change, that actually it's really hard to change course.
Yeah, I think it's all of those. I mean, in South Africa's case, I should just say, by the way, I visit the country periodically now, including teaching in Johannesburg, MBA students, postgraduate students, and really enjoy it. And I think it's completely different from when I left as a boy. So it's much, much better.
Yep.
You know, you've got a constitution that protects the human rights of everybody, regardless of the colour of their skin.
Drafted largely in the library on the University of Sussex campus by Albie Sachs.
By Albie Sachs, yes, on Oliver Tambo's instructions. The South African constitution is probably the best in the world. We don't
it's
even
a
have
very
a proper,
radical constitution,
yeah,
isn't
is.
it? I mean,
we don't have a proper constitution here in Britain, but that's by the way. So I don't want to give an impression that the country, you know, is somehow gone back to bad old ways. It's still a much, much better country for the majority of people. But it could have been so much better if particularly this Zuma episode. But having said that, the 10 years in which he shamelessly looted the country and the corruption was really brazen, the problem now is it's so deeply ingrained, it's like a cancer in the body. It's really difficult to get out. So having said that there's lots that's good about the country, there's also this problem. And I think that it's not, I think none of us is saints. So you asked about temptation. You know, people do sometimes fiddle their expenses, do ordinary respectable citizens. So I think there's perhaps a temptation in every human being to maximize, to push the boundaries and maximize your opportunities. But then there's something else you implied, which is that goes back to what I said at the beginning about the anti-apartheid movement and all of these movements being in minorities, including the suffragettes, now applauded, big exhibitions in Parliament and so on, and great. But actually, you look at what was said about them at the time and done to them at the time. They're Palestinian supporters who are on hunger strike at the moment, or at least were. I think the last one who's nearly died has just ended his hunger strike. But the suffragettes were on hunger strikes as well. And there was no sympathy for them in the House of Lords at the time. And there's no sympathy for the Palestinian protesters in the House of Lords today, except for myself and a few others. So I think it's important to recognize that there were big forces always opposed to these changes. So, for example, you know, Margaret Thatcher, who was British Prime Minister at the time, was denouncing Nelson Mandela as a terrorist a matter of a year or two before he walked to freedom. So, you know, they're big, whether it's big corporations or arms dealers or whatever, employing a lot of people in places, including in my former South Wales constituency, whose jobs depend on this, that these forces are still there. And that, you touched upon the multinational management consultancies and auditors and so on. The reason I got first involved in this whole thing was I was asked by senior members of the ANC in 2017 to expose the international complicity and culpability in all of this, which I did under parliamentary privilege in the Lord from information they supplied to me. So that's where my interest in this started. Otherwise, I don't think the book would ever have been written.
So what needs to be done? I mean, what are the answers to, you know, how can democratic control be reasserted? How can corruption be thwarted?
Well, I think there are a number of sort of priorities, and I discussed some of these in the last chapter. One of them is an international anti-corruption court. There is an international criminal court at the moment and an international court of justice, but those are focused on genocide and so on, and war crimes and so forth. They don't have a remit, and it's not within their scope to tackle corruption. And yet corruption, I think it's something like $2 trillion a year. $2 trillion a year. That's almost unimaginable amount of money is looted and corruptly money laundered around the world every year.
And basically going to people to enrich individuals, to make them richer and richer, and taking money away from public spending.
And from some of the poorest citizens of the world, because, you know, when the looting happened in South Africa or Nicaragua for that moment, Nicaragua is an extremely poor country, one of the poorest in the world. South Africa is relatively better off by comparison, including on the African continent, where I think it's still the richest country in the continent per capita. But these countries are also in the grip of a global system. So one of the chief villains that I devote a bit of space to in the book was Bain & Company, who are internationally reputable management consultancy. Had contracts with our government, with governments across the world, got offices all over the place. And, you know, they're a big brand in that world. They used their expertise at President Zuma's personal request to disable the tax agency, South African tax agency, so that it couldn't chase down the kind of villains that were funding him and supporting him, and tobacco smugglers and others. That's what Bain & Company actually advised in 17 personal meetings with Zuma, not in his office, but in his private residence, where there would be no minutes, to take his instructions and then go and put a policeman at the head of South African Revenue Service, SARS, in order to take it apart and disable it.
Was there ever any comeback? Did they ever suffer any
they've actually had to close their office in South Africa now. And I've been trying to get them barred from public contracts in Britain to get any government contracts. And I noticed I'd written about the latest one that involved a partnership to supply training to the Ministry of Defence. And they didn't get that, whether as a result of my letter or other competitive pressures, I don't know. So I'm still chasing them down, and they don't like me. But there we are. You know, none of these people particularly like me. Although what was interesting was when it broke in the House of Lords and was then reported in the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal and so on, suddenly I got all these chief executives of you know, KPMG and McKinsey and HSBC wanting to come and see me in my office.
They're some of the organisations that are named as being deeply implicated.
Yes, yeah. So I was happy to see them. Although HSBC said to me, I said, you moved the money out. Yes, we did. Though we've closed the accounts now. I said, well, good. But what happened to the money? It's gone. It went into Dubai and it went into Hong Kong and other places, ended up in UK overseas territories like the British Virgin Islands, through a whole series of shell companies, front companies, where the real owners, President Zuma's business friends, the Gupta brothers, were never revealed, but actually were the beneficial owners. So what are you doing about it? This money went out by the billions of rand, in hundreds of millions of pounds sterling and dollars, through your digital pipelines. Oh, but that's client confidentiality. But I said client confidentiality applies to honest citizens, doesn't it? To all of you, I'll make an assumption, Sasha and I, well, I like to think we're all honest citizens. We expect client confidentiality. These guys move hundreds of millions around through these same banks' digital pipelines, and by the way, I pointed this out, leaves a digital trail, so you could track this money down. Oh, no, that's not possible, it's gone, but we've closed their accounts. And then there was one of them I was giving evidence to. It's quite funny, actually. It's serious as well. I was giving evidence to the judicial commission that had been established to look into the whole Zuma decade by his successor president, was set up under him. And I was asked to give evidence, and they wanted written evidence. So with the help of people who knew a lot more about it than I did, I sent in a 10,000-word written statement. And it's circulated to all the people you name, so that they have a right of reply. So it's very kind of proper judicially. I didn't mind that. So Standard Chartered wrote it an email saying, Lord Hain's got this completely wrong. Our Johannesburg office is nothing to do with our Dubai office. So all this money, yes, it left our office in Johannesburg, but it's then in a different jurisdiction. So it's nothing to do with us. So I take a pretty dim view of that. And my reply was, when in holes, stop digging. But, these are global institutions, global corporations. They're all digitally connected.
So an international court is really the only way.
I think that's one of the key things, one of the many things. Yeah. It's not going to be a cure-all, but it is important to try to achieve it.
I'm going to open up to see if there are any questions from the audience now. So, yes, has someone got a microphone? Down here, please. Do you want to just put your hand up so that she can see where you are? Thank you.
Thanks.
And do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure.
You are someone who knows quite a lot about this.
Liz David-Barrett, I'm the director of the Centre for the Study of Corruption that we have here at Sussex. So thanks, Peter. Really fascinating talk, and it's a great book, and it really resonates actually with a lot of the research that we do at the Centre, particularly on state capture, which is a big theme in our research and in our teaching. Also resonates with me actually personally as someone, I used to be a journalist and I was working in the Balkans, and we saw again a lot of this, leaders who were essentially coming to power with an agenda about, you might say, making the country great again, or an independence agenda, then getting into power and essentially selling off all of the state assets to their cronies, in a pattern that becomes very familiar and is very familiar at the moment around the world. But my question to you is that in a way what's especially interesting about you writing this book is that you're a politician. So you've been on that side, you've been in that problem of sort of the individual versus the system. So I'd like to ask you, what you think that we can learn about the dilemma in that situation and how you deal with those tensions and how you can operate in a system which potentially is systemically corrupt and doesn't have much overall political will to fight corruption.
Right, well, thank you. And much to my shame, when Sasha mentioned, we had a session before this to just go over what we might talk about. You mentioned the centre, your centre. And much to my shame, I didn't know anything about it. And so here you're doing the similar work. You probably know a lot more about it than me. I think the answer to your question is very complicated. But I think it requires every major capital involved. It requires Beijing and Delhi, because the Gupta brothers, who are President Zuma's cronies, are actually originated from India and went back there when they were chased out of South Africa. So most of the money went through Dubai or Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, former British colony, but Chinese controlled. Dubai controlled by the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. So you've got to get every country sort of signed up to tackling this problem, or it's just going to go somewhere else. And that includes, you know, we pride ourselves, including the current British government, on being anti-money laundering, anti-corruption, anti-all of that stuff. But actually, a lot of the money ends up in UK overseas territories. A lot of it comes through London. Some of it's invested in the London property market. So
absolutely. Isn't the London property market absolutely full of it?
it is, yeah. And these are, you know, some of the Russian oligarchs are being hounded down and identified and restricted, and that's good. Putin's kind of cronies, that's good because that whole system's corrupt under him, including him. But actually, there's a bigger culpability. And so I think we've got to look closer to home, all of us. But it's an international problem. Unless you get, and I'd sort of argue this at some point, unless you get a lot of the governments of the world cooperating to doing something about this, you're not going to stop it, is the truth. And too many people are making too much money out of it still, including in the City of London. Because you require, this is the other, you know, you've got a lot of what are called professional enablers. You've got auditors and accountants and financial advisors and lawyers and estate agents who are all making this possible. The Zuma and his business cronies, the Gupta brothers, couldn't have set up these shell companies and moved the money around unless they'd had professional advice. So all these professionals are actually breaking the codes of their professions, the ethical side of their professions and the standards, yeah. and are complicit or up to their necks in all of this stuff. So it's you've got a big challenge on in your centre to sort of confront all of this, but I hope the book helps anyway.
I mean, one of the things that you were involved in, which I should have said when I was introducing you, but there was so much to say about your career. But you know, you chaired the UN Security Council,
yeah,
and as well as negotiating an international treaty on nuclear proliferation, you were very involved in one about trade in blood diamonds. So, kind of international treaties targeting particular aspects of corruption. I mean, that's a particularly... You know,
yeah, it's funny, the blood diamonds one, I didn't think about it as
being think it was corruption at the time.
Didn't think about it, but I suppose there was that important dimension to it. It arose because I was concerned as Britain's Minister for Africa, the only African-born Britain Minister for Africa that there's ever been, and maybe ever will be, I don't know. But I was concerned about going to Angola and Sierra Leone, and I didn't ever go to the DRC, but it was to a conflict zone. And then having this intelligence reports from MI6 and GCHQ on my desk, which clearly showed we knew who these arms dealers were. They were flying in the arms to these conflict zones, getting paid in blood diamonds. And I think I might have been one of the first, if not the first, to use that phrase. These are diamonds, mostly alluvial diamonds, scooped off the bottom of rivers rather than deep mined, as, for example, they are in South Africa and Botswana and Namibia, and paid in diamonds. So I started off thinking, well, how are we going to stop these guys? So I did name them in Parliament, which they didn't like, and some of them threatened me, but there you are. But I then thought we're going to have to try and get an international treaty banning this. And the trade didn't like it. And I had representations, including from the ANC government in Pretoria, to say, hang on, you know, diamonds are a big part of our economy, and Botswana and Namibia and so on, as well as, you know, a lot of other countries, Israel and Russia were actually particularly angry about it. And not that they mined, well, I don't think Israel has diamond mines, but it does process the stuff. So eventually, but I said, look, if you don't clean up your trade and you don't stop the the illegal blood diamonds coming in from these conflict zones, fueling war, then you're going to tarnish the whole reputation. So say somebody getting married is given a diamond ring, they won't know whether that's a blood diamond or a genuine one. So in the end, it took a lot of persuasion, but we managed to persuade the trade to accept, including the World Diamond Council in Antwerp, to actually accept the basis for a treaty.
Interesting. Let's see if there are any other questions. Oh, lots. Okay. There's a woman in the middle here. Who's got the... Oh, okay. It's fine. Have Govinda. That's fine.
Okay. Hi.
Do you want to just introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Gurminda Bambra. I'm Professor of Historical Sociology here at the university. Thank you so much for the talk and actually for all the work that you've done politically over the last decades. It's very much appreciated. I had a question, though, because in a sense, you seem to locate your interest in corruption in a post-colonial context in terms of the failure of liberation movements to achieve what it is that they had hoped to achieve. But it feels like, in part, you locate that failure in the individuals involved in the liberation movements, as opposed to perhaps thinking about it in terms of the failure to actually transform the conditions that they were seeking liberation or independence from. So in a sense, there's this aspect, like, I guess the question is, to what extent do you think that the political transformation you would have liked to have seen could only happen if there had been an economic transformation at the same time? I mean, in the sense that you locate it as post-colonial and you talk about colonialism as corrupt, and what colonialism did was drain resources out of these places.
Under them, yeah.
And so corruption in a context of a country that's been drained of its resources is different than the corruption that drains the resources. And so I was just wondering about that relationship and to what extent it also features in your analysis.
I think it features quite a lot, to be fair. It isn't just about personal failings. I think I'd say...
No, and probably I'm a bit of a, I've got my kind of psychoanalytic bent, so I was going down that route. How much is this about individuals? I don't think that's what Peter says.
No, I don't think it's an excuse. You shouldn't excuse anybody doing this, but I do think there are systemic reasons why it happened, and I think you're quite right to point that out. But in my own defense, I think there's a fair amount of analysis which points exactly that out.
I mean, is there a question also, though, about how far the transformation has got before the corruption sets in? At what point is the sort of disappointment in the liberation movement happening? Is it sort of straight away, or is it actually some way down the road when the movement has really failed to deliver the transformation that it set out to, and so then there's the kind of reversion back?
I do think there's an issue about the limited amount of transformation, which is behind your question as well, especially economic transformation. That in South Africa it's probably the most unequal society in the world. The most unequal society in the world, in a world where the gap between those at the very top and the rest is widening. But that's a whole critique of neoliberalism, which I'm happy to sort of rant about, but probably not on this occasion. But I do think that genuine economic transformation could have mitigated some of that. On the other hand, you become very aware, say in the ANC's case, they came to power and there are critics now, radical critics, I think they're wrong, and ahistorical about Mandela calling him a sellout and so on, for not actually negotiating a transition, because that was genuinely transformative economically as well as politically. I think it's ahistorical because, the white minority at that time, and there were 4 years of negotiations, and the white minority, backed by Margaret Thatcher and others, tried to hang on to sort of a veto power in the negotiations, and it was Mandela, amongst others in the ANC leadership, who refused to go along with that. But they had all the power, they had all the guns, they had all the army, they had the police, they had the economic power. And when you look at countries which have experienced revolutionary transitions, Mozambique, for example, or Angola, they have civil wars that go on for years and completely decimate the country. One of the things you can say about South Africa is it hasn't had that. It's still got massive problems, and there's a lot of social unrest because of the lack of economic transformation. There's a new black middle class and a rich black elite, which is very different when it was a white middle class and a rich white elite. So that's progress in terms of multiracialism, but the actual fundamental divide is still there. And that is a major factor as well.
Thank you. Okay, other questions. In the striped scarf.
Hi, Jonathan Walgar, doctoral student. You mentioned briefly the Nicaraguan leader, who you described as a corrupt misogynist, and I was curious if sort of gender is a sort of relevant factor at all in your analysis.
It's a good question, Jonathan. I also described him as nepotistic, because he's trying to get his family sort of, to succeed him. And that's, of course, contrary to everything. And Jacob Zuma tried to do that. I mean, South Africa has one of the most gender progressive constitutions in the world. But that hasn't stopped a patriarchal society from being very predominant, and including levels of rape and domestic violence, which are horrifyingly large. So I don't think, if this is what you're asking, I don't think the gender divide and gender inequality, which affects the whole world, is particularly intrinsic to this story, though it happens to be that most of the liberation leaders are blokes, if not all of them, and come to power, and they're the ones that have ended up betraying the struggle. But I don't know what would have happened had there been women leaders of those liberation struggles.
Other questions? Yes, here in a brown gilet.
Wow.
My name is Vivian Barton. I'm a local resident and former passionate anti-apartheid activist. My question to you, Peter, is the UK more or less corrupt than it was when you began in politics 50 years ago?
Well, first of all, Vivian, thank you for what you did, because the anti-apartheid struggle was based on many thousands of people doing what you did, or it wouldn't have been won. Is it worse than when I first became involved? Well, I think it's more complicated. I think there's always been corruption, including in Britain, but it's now more digitized. There's more sort of complex, which is part of what the shell companies and all of this, and the moving of money around the world digitally, as opposed to in brown paper bags and stuff, which it used to be moved around in. That's become both more sort of subterranean, but also actually more difficult to confront and deal with.
Any others? Yes, in the I'm having to describe colours of clothes that I'm like the sort of fawn-coloured jacket.
Thank you.
We've got to all be careful what we're wearing in this case.
My name is Lerato. I am South African, and I am an undergrad student studying politics and international relations. Thank you for the talk. My question, I'll try to phrase it well. My question is, I think obviously in the case of South Africa, we did see a break or a significant sort of shift between Mandela gets, elected, and then we have his presidency, and then we have Thabo Mbeki's presidency. So there was a clear shift when Zuma came into power. And I think given the fact that your book is about liberation and corruption, to what extent can we actually place the ANC under Zuma into that whole picture of liberation? Because I think in as much as there was a lot going on with the, Mbeki administration, I think it's fair to say that both of those administrations were just presidencies trying to figure out policies in a country. But there was a clear shift when Zuma came. So how much can we tie that shift to liberation when we saw something different under two presidencies, even if it was in the same party? I hope.
No, very good question. Which part of the country are you from, by the way?
I'm from Limpopo.
Limpopo, right.
Yeah, yeah.
That's north of Pretoria,
Yeah.
by the way, anybody who's not sure of the geography. So you're a Limpopo girl talking to a Pretoria boy. Yeah, there you are. Well, I discuss in the book a very interesting analysis by Rusty Bernstein, which was written, I think, in 1990 and certainly published in early 91. He's a former senior ANC figure, South African Communist Party member, who saw in the ANC, even at that stage, well before the transition had been negotiated, the signs of corruption. And his analysis is really interesting because and I quote it quite significantly, because it starts with East and Central Europe and communist parties in power there, and how the elite gets control and then it becomes corrupt itself. So he started off from that standpoint, began, and then applied it to what he was observing in the country. So you're right to say that it became brazen and shameless and under Zuma, who just plundered the country. But the roots of it were already there. And of course, the arms deal, mainly involving British companies and the ANC government, was negotiated and done well before Zuma. And that itself was said to be, and I describe a lot of evidence as to why it was criticized as being corrupt. It is then rebutted by ANC ministers, including Roddy Casseroles, for whom I've got a lot of time, and he's a friend. But anyway, I've put his point of view in there. So I think that this is a more systemic thing. I think there's something else that I haven't mentioned but touch upon. If you're a fighter, a freedom fighter in the bush of Africa, in Zambia or one of these camps in Tanzania or Angola or wherever it might have been, you don't have a pension, you don't have a home, you don't have anything of the kind that, you know, the sort of political class has become accustomed to getting, and we have in countries like Britain, which are more established democracies, though very imperfect ones in my view, and that goes right across the former colonial powers. So there's an automatic thing that, you know, some people were brazen about it and upfront saying, I'm entitled to a bit more than I had, and I've got nothing. I come, you know, suddenly the change happens and I find myself a government minister or a director general of a department or whatever, and suddenly I've got all these opportunities are opened up to me. So I think there's something in the process of change here that we've got to be upfront about. But I don't think it was just the fault of Zuma. To answer your question directly, I think the seeds of it were sown earlier, but he was absolutely brazen and shameless about it.
So we're going to have to finish in a moment, but the book ends with a chapter about the continuing fight,
yeah.
continuing struggle. But you actually really finish the book with a quote from Ben Okri, which I'm just going to read out because I think actually it in many ways sums up what I took from the book. But perhaps also the sort of bigger project that the Sussex School for Progressive Futures has to consider. So Ben Okri said, "They are only the exhausted who think that they have arrived at their final destination, the end of their road, with all their dreams achieved, with no new dreams to hold."
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a great book, Peter.
Thank you.
You have done the most amazing things since you were at Sussex. We hope you continue doing lots more amazing things. Don't leave the House of Lords yet, even if you think that you're getting old. There's still lots of work to be done. Thank you for coming back.
No, thank you for inviting
everyone,
me.
Please,
and
if you would like to get a copy, it's being sold at a discount, £10 outside, and Peter will sign them. But thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to Peter.
Thanks very much. Thank you.